President Obama unveils a budget proposing significant cuts to Social Security. Has he betrayed his base? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. The president's budget is 244 pages long, but it's one paragraph on page 46 that has earned him praise from Republicans. On first reading, it seems like a simple accounting change. The president plans to switch the way Social Security benefits are indexed for inflation, from the standard consumer price index to what's called the chained CPI. But in fact, the action has enormous significance, not just for the millions of the poor and elderly who may find themselves unable to keep up with the cost of living in the future, but to the whole debate over budgets in Washington. Finally, President Obama has officially accepted a long-held goal of the right and made Social Security just another bargaining chip in negotiations. In total, the budget proposes cuts of more than $1 trillion from government programs. But there is some comfort for the base. The president wants nearly $250 million in spending on jobs, public works, and an expansion in preschool education. He's also proposed $800 billion in new taxes.
For years, the debate in this town has raged between reducing our deficits at all costs and making the investments necessary to grow our economy. And this budget answers that argument because we can do both. We can grow our economy and shrink our deficits. In fact, as we saw in the 1990s, nothing shrinks deficits faster than a growing economy.
I'm joined by Nancy Altman, co-director of Social Security Works and author of The Battle for Social Security. Ryan Grimm is Washington bureau chief for the Huffington Post, and Simon Rosenberg is president of the New Democrat Network. Simon, so here is this enormous document. What does this actually represent, though? I mean, we're not expecting any imminent legislation from it, are we? Though?
No, but I think if there's a big deal done this year, I think it's going to look a lot like what the president put out today. And I think the president is clearly trying to do a deal with the Republicans. He wants to get a big deal done on deficit reduction in the budget before he leaves office. And I think this was a balanced and thoughtful approach that takes into is more focused on growth than the Republicans and probably a little bit more focused on deficit reduction than some of the Democrats would want.
And Ron, I mean, there are a range of things in here, and some of them are pretty worthwhile. The Buffett rule makes an appearance, 30% tax on millionaires, $78 million to intercept an asteroid, which sounds interesting.
Could be the best money ever spent.
Taxing cigarettes taxing cigarettes to pay for preschool education. I mean, are these things are we likely to see these in the future then? Or?
No, probably not. Right? I mean, these are the things that he's been pushing for in every deal that he's tried to strike with the Republicans over the last couple of years, and they haven't made it through so far. Now, we had an election, and in some countries after you have an election, then the agenda that was carried by the party that won is the one that's implemented, and then people decide whether or not they like that, and then you have another election, but not in this country. You know, Washington does not move legislation through no matter what the election says. So, I'm not too hopeful, but he does have a passion for the pre-K funding.
Well, interestingly, though, I mean, there is an argument to make this is a very unprogressive way to fund pre-K because it's disproportionately poor people who smoke. I mean,
well, if you persuade these poor people to smoke less, then you're probably making their lives a little longer and better.
Right, but then also if you persuade them to smoke less, then there's not enough money for pre-K education.
And they have had those problems with the cigarette taxes, that people smoke less and they make less money.
Well, let's move on then, because I think there are all sorts of things here, but it's page 46. That is the really significant page, perhaps. So let me read out that. It's just 3 paragraphs. And in some ways, you could easily miss it, frankly. And certainly the White House hasn't made a huge song and dance about this one page. But here we go. In the interest of achieving a bipartisan deficit reduction agreement beginning in 2015, the budget would change the measure of inflation used by the federal government for most programs and for the Internal Revenue Code, from the standard Consumer Price Index, CPI, to the alternative, more accurate chain CPI, which grows slightly more slowly. unlike the standard CPI, the chained CPI fully accounts for a consumer's ability to substitute between goods in response to changes in relative prices and also adjusts for small sample bias. Most economists agree that the chained CPI provides a more accurate measure of the average change in the cost of living than the standard CPI. We'll get into the specifics of what's being said there in a moment. But Nancy Altman, how significant is it for that paragraph to be in a budget presented by a Democratic president?
It's extremely significant. First of all, his own Secretary of the Treasury said in a USA Today op-ed that Social Security has nothing to do with the deficit. And past Congresses have tried very hard to keep Social Security separate. So the very idea of proposing these kinds of changes as part of deficit reduction is a mistake. And what it does is it reinforces American suspicions that their money is being raided. Too many Americans think that now.
But interestingly, Simon, changing the CPI, or the way that the Social Security benefits are worked out, wasn't even in the Republican budget. It wasn't in the Paul Ryan budget. So it's actually President Obama who's putting this on the table.
Well, they've been arguing for it rhetorically.
Right, but they don't put it in their actual budget proposals, do they?
Right,
This is President Obama's plan.
In fact, the Republicans are already attacking him today for cutting benefits to seniors, even though, as he says in his own words, he's doing this with the hope of getting a bipartisan deal. I mean, there's an acknowledgement that this is essentially, that he's throwing a olive branch out to the right for this, and their response is to run ads attacking him.
Well, let's look at that concept, Ryan. Is this merely an olive branch to the right, a compromise? Or is it, in fact, something that President Obama has pretty much argued for years, actually? This has been actually his own personal goal, is to change the way that Social Security is ordered and works in this country.
I think one way to answer that is to say that it almost doesn't matter what President Obama wants. You know, because President Obama is going to do what Congress allows him to do and what the people drive him to do. What's actually in Obama's heart? You know, he's called himself a moderate Republican. He's told blue dogs that he's a blue dog.
You know, he had one of the on the right of the party.
Right. Yeah. He had one of the most liberal voting records of anybody in the Senate. You know, what does he actually believe? He seems like he wants. He seems like he is extremely concerned about the deficit. And if you read some of the books that have come out about his early weeks and months, he had to be talked out of doing deficit stuff right away and doing a stimulus as big as he did. You know, he is a deficit hog at heart. If I had to guess at what is in that heart of his.
But the Social Security has nothing to do with the deficit.
It doesn't matter. Like, to deficit hawks, they go wherever the money is. You know, even you can tell them, hey, this does not contribute to the deficit. It doesn't matter. If it can lead to them getting a deal to get the deficit down, then in their minds it's fine.
We'll develop that idea as to whether this actually is about the deficit or whether it's about fundamental economic ideology, I guess, and an approach to how society should work. But let's look then at the specific sentences in this, the specific assertions in this paragraph then. First of all then, is the chained CPI then a more accurate measure of the cost of living, Nancy?
Not at all, and it's wrong that most economists, the statement that most economists think so. We have a letter of 250 economists saying that for this population, it's less accurate, and it's
right, this population, you mean the elderly?
Seniors and people with disabilities, who primarily are the ones who receive Social Security. It's clear they don't even think it's more accurate because they want to exempt means-tested programs. They want to, if it's more accurate, why do you exempt anyone?
Right, that's exactly right. The elderly are already making these decisions that economists are saying having less money requires you to do. What they're basically saying is that if a price of a certain good rises, somebody will actually, in real life, will go out and find a comparable good at the same price. But what they're actually saying is that if you give somebody less money, they still manage to get by.
Right.
But they're not getting by the way they wanted to get by before. What you end up with is a very simple statement, that when you give people less money, you make them poorer. That's all it is. These people are going to become poorer.
And there's no question that it's simply a talking point. I don't think anyone would say that if the chain CPI cost more money, that would be in the budget.
But I mean, specifically though, I mean, can the elderly and the disabled, Simon, make a consumer decision on what their health needs are and what sort of health treatment they need? Isn't that where this kind of falls down, or at least the logic does?
Look, as I said earlier, I think they admit in the very first sentence that this is a political, there's politics behind this, right? I mean, they, in their own, the thing you just read on the air. And I think that the president, I will say that I think the president has done should get a little bit of credit for having repudiated the sort of rush to austerity that's coming out from the right. I mean, I may not be happy with everything that's in here, but I also don't think this is I don't think this budget is a capitulation to the Republicans. I think that there's an out-of-control, reckless Republican Party right now that is advocating an economic path that would do harm to the country. The president, by advocating for preschool, for investment in infrastructure, right, he's done a very progressive health care bill, that he is setting up, I think, an alternative argument where he can say that he is taking care of his coalition, the coalition that got him elected to office. And it may not be done in a way that the old Democratic coalition wants, but he's building a new and different coalition for the 21st century.
But you use that term capitulation. I mean, as we were just suggesting, it's not a capitulation, actually. It's a fundamental restructuring of how, of the economy that he seems to deeply believe in, perhaps, there, right? I mean,
in what way? You mean in terms of entitlement reform?
Yeah.
No, we have to reform entitlements. We have to spend less money on entitlements.
Right. Well,
in the United States.
Doing it.
We have to cut defense. Yeah. We have to reform entitlements. We have to raise taxes if we want to make a dent in the deficit. We have to do all three. The president wants to do all three. The Republicans only want to do one of those three things.
Well, unfortunately, the entitlement frame is a right-wing talking point that's become conventional wisdom in Washington. Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are each quite different programs, structured quite differently, with quite different issues facing them. Social Security is, as far as the eye can see, about 6% of gross domestic product. It should be increased, not reduced.
But I mean, in
Medicare
real terms,
and Medicaid are health care issues.
In real terms, what does this change do to the ability for a senior or someone who's disabled to make ends meet? I mean, has it been worked out what difference this will make?
Oh, absolutely. 2/3 of seniors rely on Social Security for half or more of their income. So the median income of seniors is $20,000. So what you're trying, a third of seniors receive 90% or more of their income from Social Security, and what you're doing is you're cutting their benefits. So you're talking about a population that already is either in poverty or close to poverty, and their benefits are going to erode over time. And the cruel part is the older you get, when you've exhausted other resources, your health care needs are the highest, the cuts are the biggest because it's cumulative.
And there is actually, if you really are concerned about accuracy, there is a CPI-E which is being developed, I suppose, right?
And a number of members of the Senate and the House have proposed that, and that makes perfect sense.
But that's not on the agenda, or at the, I mean,
it's not in the president's budget. They're asking for the chain CPI, not the CPI-E.
And Ryan, it's not just seniors actually who are affected by this. There are tax implications for anyone earning $100,000 a year.
Right. And there's all disabled veterans are also impacted by this. But yeah, so it would raise $100 billion plus because people's incomes would grow faster than the tax brackets would increase. So you get what's called bracket creep. So it's similar to the alternative minimum tax, where you wind up paying a little extra tax over the years. So I talked to a couple of Republicans on the Hill about that today, and they seemed okay with that. You know, if they could get the pound of flesh out of Social Security, then they were okay with
the poorer in society paying more tax, then basically.
Well, everyone pays a little more.
But it's regressive in the way that it's structured.
It is regressive.
The earned income tax credit, which is a refundable tax credit for working poor, would be shrunk, and it would really hit hardest middle income and low income taxpayers. So you're saying these are the ones
rich are already mostly
they
in the
will
top
be paying
bracket.
more during their working years because of the chain CPI, then they'll get less in their retirement years because of the chain CPI.
Well, let's continue our textual analysis of these three paragraphs then on page 46. Switching to the chain CPI, the budget goes on, which will reduce deficits and improve Social Security solvency, has been proposed in almost every major bipartisan deficit reduction plan put forward over the past several years. And then it goes on to name a few, including Bowles-Simpson, which many people have heard of, and so forth. So then there is this pretty explicit linking then between Social Security and deficits there, Simon. Isn't that where the danger lies then? Is when you start putting those two words together, or those three words together, deficit, Social Security.
As I said, I think the president, we're doing contextual analysis.
Yeah.
I think he tipped his hand in the first sentence, which is they're doing this as what they believe to be a political olive branch to the Republicans. I also just want to agree that, you know, of the three entitlement programs that we discussed, Medicare is the one that needs the most attention and focus. Social Security My own economist, my own organization put out a piece a week ago saying, Social Security is not a problem, don't worry about it, right? And so I think that the president's clearly made a political decision.
And you accept it, though, even though you can see it's not.
No, I'm explaining what he did. You asked me to explain what he did. And I think they've made a decision that they really are going to try very hard to get a deal. And look, it's not out of the realm of possibility, right? We're seeing progress on gun violence legislation. We're seeing bipartisan progress on immigration reform. The test will be that if we end up with 3 bills this year that are way to the right of center and don't achieve liberal, center-left objectives.
Is this a center-left issue, or is this an American? I mean, polls would suggest it's most Americans. Nancy.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that. This is really, the American people are overwhelmingly united in this. AARP just came out with a poll that showed, and every poll shows this. They looked at voters 50 and over. 91% of Democrats, 80% of Republicans reject this. The American people, they're all in agreement, no change CPI. They'd like the CPIE. It's the elites in Washington against the American people.
We're already running out of time, sadly. So let's once and for all discuss 2 things. First of all, what role does Social Security play in the deficit? No.
0. It is the most responsible part of the federal budget. It is off budget. It has its own dedicated revenue. It has no borrowing authority. It is, and it cannot pay benefits unless it has income to cover the cost.
And as we look at the deficit rise, which actually has been going down anyway over the last few years, but what did cause this deficit specifically, or at least much of it?
Well, I mean, most of the deficit was created by a couple of wars and some massive tax cuts, and several recessions brought about by bank crises and subsequent bailouts.
And so you see then that, Simon, that's why we say, many people are saying, well, hang on. Actually, AFL-CIO has just come out, the union has just come out with a statement saying, a president's budget is more than just numbers. It's a profoundly moral document. We believe cutting Social Security benefits and shifting costs to Medicare beneficiaries while exempting corporate America from shared sacrifice is wrong and indefensible. It's this idea that President Obama, no matter what sort of deal he's trying to get, has accepted a fundamental framework where it's the poorest in society who pay for the tax cuts on the rich and the rich's wars, frankly, as well.
Well, I think the president wouldn't agree with that, right? That's certainly not the language that he used today. And I think, look, part of the raw politics of this is that he's only in office a few more years. He wants to get things done. He's dealing with a pretty crazy Republican Party right now, and when he sits down and negotiates with these guys, he's got a very difficult set of decisions to make. On immigration reform, there's some things that he's going to accept that are just silly, frankly, and that it's not ideological left and right. It's just silly demands by the other side, which they've accepted as part of a deal. One could argue that this accepting change CPI is a silly concession, intellectually, ideologically,
silly,
but required politically in order to move forward. This is the art of politics, right? There's pragmatism here. He's clearly made a decision that a deal is within his grasp this year. He wants to do it. Right. This is the sign.
Well, we'll look at that pragmatism in a moment. Just very quickly again, Nancy, because we have this moment. Is Social Security going bust?
Absolutely not. It can pay every penny of its benefits in full for the next 20 years. After that, there does need to be some adjustment, but the United States...
So are there alternatives that don't cut benefits to the poorest in society?
Absolutely. All we need is, it's less than 1% of GDP in additional revenue, much less than the Bush tax cuts, would more than fund this program for 75 years and beyond.
And the other point is that what kind of deal are you getting? Like, right, let's say you took a whole bunch of money from the elderly, if you only use it to pay down the deficit, then everyone is poorer over the long run. Let's say you take a whole bunch of money from the elderly, and you do create some brand new, universal quality pre-K for everyone. That's at least you're expanding the state there. But to only reduce the size of government in order to just pay down the deficit is exactly what Grover Norquist has always wanted. He's wanted to create these big deficits so that you
the
are
person
forced
basically wants to make government small enough to drown in a bath.
You're forced to reduce the size and scope of government.
Let's just continue our textual analysis one last time then. Third paragraph. There's only 3 paragraphs.
We're back in college.
The president has made you learn some useful things in college. The president has made clear that any such change in approach should protect the most vulnerable. For that reason, the budget includes protections for the very elderly and others who rely on Social Security for long periods of time, and only applies the change to non-means tested benefit programs. And then again, the switch to change CPI will reduce deficits by at least $230 billion over the next 10 years. Here, end of page 46. Nancy, does it protect the poorest as written here?
It protects them somewhat, but not enough. The problem is two problems. One is, as if we're doing contextual analysis, it's inconsistent with the idea that it's more accurate, that you need to protect someone from accuracy. But more to the point, the numerous, something like 3 million seniors are what are called dual eligibles. So their SSI will be protected, but their Social Security will not. There are millions of others who don't qualify for Social Security. SSI's very stringent test, but any of us would say those people are extremely poor. So it doesn't even do what it intends to do. It sounds good. It's a good talking point. We're going to shield the poor, but we've looked at the numbers carefully, and if you really were to protect them, you wouldn't get any savings, and there'd be no point in doing it.
All right. Well, the reaction from the Republicans has been moderately welcoming, at least from the leadership. I mean, others have been more welcoming. But here's what John Boehner had to say.
And while the president has backtracked on some of his entitlement reforms that were in conversations that we had a year and a half ago, he does deserve some credit for some incremental entitlement reforms they has outlined in his budget. But I would hope that he would not hold hostage these modest reforms for his demand for bigger tax hikes.
So Simon, I mean, this is the question. If this is a negotiating position, the question I suppose people are asking is President Obama is assuring the base by saying, look, we'd only ever do this if we got significant tax increases rather on the rich. Is it possible to hold on to that, or now that this whole concept has been introduced, it's simply a matter of how much Social Security will be cut, not if it will be cut?
There were administration spokespeople saying on background that unless there are significant tax increases, there's no deal. And I do think that part of what's underlying this is that one of the great tensions in our budget politics for the next 20 years or 30 years is going to be we have a very big generation that's retiring, and we have to make sure that they have the resources to have a good and sound retirement. We also, though, have the largest group of young people that's ever existed in American history who are being starved of investment. There isn't enough infrastructure investments, schools, and other things. We're spending much less on the future than we used to be because we're spending so much to maintain the retiring baby boomers. The president is clearly sending, I think, a big signal that he wants to redistribute money away from the boomer generation to this large millennial generation. And I think that's where the Democratic future is, and that's where, let me just finish, is that I think there's something more profound going on here than just rich and poor. There's also about this generational politics that is going to be a brutal flashpoint in our country for the next 20 years.
Nancy?
You know, another theme has been intergenerational warfare. In America's families, children are not better off if their grandparents are in poverty, and grandparents aren't better off if their grandchildren aren't educated. There's much more concern through a generation. What the real issue is, the wealth inequality we have for the very top and everybody else. And so instead of trying to pit seniors against children, both of whom need more investment and more spending, we should be going after what the American people say they want, which is to make the top pay their fair share. Social Security has been extremely important in income redistribution, and it is overwhelmingly popular with the American people, as is taxing the top 1%. And so this is one where the Democrats should have the wind at their back, but instead it's now the Democratic proposal.
Help us understand why they've taken this tack then. I mean, is this simply because the budget deficit in recent years has looked so terrifying and people have said, and of course the boomer generation and all that, so something has to be done now about Social Security, or is it about a longer campaign about Social Security that's been going on for decades?
Well, there certainly has been a very long campaign with Pete Peterson and the Koch brothers and so forth, putting literally Pete Peterson $1 billion of his own money to convince mainly policymakers that Social Security is going bankrupt, it's in crisis, we have to do something, it's a problem rather than a solution. Whether it's that's taken hold, and that I don't say I can read the president's mind, but I think that I don't know where he's going, but he is out of step with the Democratic Party, and he's out of step with the American people in this
even
proposal.
the culture in D.C., Ryan, then, that this became the #1 issue, even during a downturn and when the jobs were needed and everything else. I mean, where does this come from, then, you think?
Well, the money from Peterson certainly doesn't hurt. I mean, if Pete Peterson would spend $500 million hiring people in Washington, former governors and former senators, to go on cable news and say that we need to fix the jobs crisis immediately, if he spread $500 million on that, we'd be talking a lot more about the jobs crisis. $500 million in a small town like this does end up going a long way.
Ryan Grimm, thank you very much. Simon Rosenberg, thank you. Nancy Altman, thank you as well.
Thanks so much.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.